Welcome back to the podcast. It's your host, John Scardina. I am so excited for this episode. I have an amazing opportunity to have Latasha Thompson on here. She's the director of DHS Safety Act. We're going to talk about what that means. But just as a little backup, or as we talk about this conversation, I met Latasha probably almost about a year ago now when we were looking at building the emergency management response for dynamic populations course, and we kind of accidentally stumbled across it. We were, of course, in terms of competencies, trying to help emergency managers deal with crisis leadership and to walk through different scenario types so that they could be more effective in disaster, right? And so that was kind of the game plan as we were building it. But in due course of that, we found this cool conference, and I saw this title, DHS Safety Act, and what is DHS Safety Act? And so I started diving in deeper, and I learned that there's an entire segment that can help out emergency managers, security professionals in stadiums and other locations learn about protecting themselves against terrorism and looking at all these different aspects that DHS has designated to help them out. And so with that background in mind, I've gotten to know Latasha. She's an amazing resource. If you are good friends with her like I am, you get to call her Tasha, but we'll be professional on this. But without further ado, I'd like to bring her on the show and hear from her perspective to help you in the field see what DHS Safety Act is all about, and it could possibly help you out in your field. So here we go. Hello, Tasha.
Hi, John. How are you?
I'm fantastic. I'm so excited to have you on here. Thanks for making the time to talk with me today.
Yes, I'm just so glad we were able to make this happen.
I know we kept on trying there for a while, so I'm glad we finally pulled it off. But so you're out there in DC, and I'm here in St. Louis, and it's too far apart, to be honest, because you provide such an amazing perspective of not only DHS Safety Act, but you came out to a DIPOP before, and I could see your leadership style. And so you are such a great resource for all these different aspects that we can learn from on a podcast. And so just to give some context, I kind of gave a brief overview, obviously. But who are you? Like, what's your background? And then can you tell us more about DHS Safety Act?
I'm actually, John, a 20-year civil servant, started in the Department of Defense as a double electronics engineer. Engineering has pretty much been my profession throughout the entire 20 years. But, John, I had this really unique perspective and ability to communicate the highly technical things to end users. And so I sort of fell into program management. And because of that, I am actually now the program manager and director for the Safety Act program. And it's really important for me to communicate that safety, if in our program, is actually an acronym. I mean, you can't be a government agency without a fabulous acronym, right? And it stands for Support Anti-Terrorism by Fostering Effective Technologies Act. And it was enacted in 2002 along with the Homeland Security Act. And the Safety Act was really born out of an interest or a reluctance, is what I should say, amongst the private sector to continue to invest and develop and deploy anti-terrorism technologies. After 9/11, it was just there were a lot of claims filed against various products and companies that may have been implicated in that terrorist event. And the government and Congress really thought, hey, we really need the private sector to continue to invest and to continue to develop and deploy these types of technologies to protect our homeland. How do we continue to innovate? And so therefore, the Safety Act was born out of that interest.
Real quick, we're going to pause for this week's Disaster Tough endorsements. How do you spell Doberman Emergency Management? EOP, OEP, HVA, HMP, Thyra, TTX, Drone, PDA. Whenever you need an expert, Doberman Emergency Management field experts are there for support. Contact an expert at DobermanEMG.com today. The L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio solves problems and is specifically designed for emergency services. How do we know? We field tested it with medical, urban search and rescue, and collapse and confined structures. This radio is amazingly tough. Check out the L3 Harris Extreme 400p radio at l3harris.com right now. Okay, let's jump back in. So when we're talking about technologies, I just did a course with Zach Borse, or an episode with Zach Borse about artificial intelligence and emerging technologies. So when you talk about technologies and counterterrorism technologies, can you provide some examples of like really what that means for you?
Sure. When we talk about technologies for the purposes of the Safety Act, we like to say it's big T technology. And we say big T because it is very broad and it was Congress's intent to be broad, right? So it can
Mm,
include products such as devices, screening devices. It can include wedge barriers. So any sort of
mm,
product, widget, or gadget, but it's also inclusive of services. So,
mm,
security services, security programs, training services, John, to
mm.
be included in that as well, risk management services, and then also different types of software. So, maybe there's an app that supports or has an anti terrorism nexus. Those are all inclusive for us in terms of what we call technologies.
Copy. So just for like my sake of understanding, because I'm learning here too a little bit. When you go in, I know you also go into venues, like you'll go into an NFL stadium and you'll say, hey, is this going to be Safety Act certified, right? Do you also go on the opposite end to go to the technology companies as well and to make sure, like, let's say, I don't know, some security camera company wants to get Safety Act. Is that even a thing, or do you do work more on the venues who are capturing all the different technologies that they could possibly use for counterterrorism?
Yeah, John, that is a very good question and a question that we get quite often. When we are evaluating a stadium or an arena for security, for Safety Act protections, we take an opportunity to look at their multi-layered approach to security. So
Mm,
it's helpful for us to see it in action
mm,
as opposed to just reading it on paper. There's some things that just doesn't elevate and rise to a level of understanding simply looking at the paper. And so we augment our evaluation by conducting site visits and going to these large venues and walking around the perimeter, having a chance to see security briefings in action, what is
mm.
communicated, having an opportunity to see ingress and egress. So it helps us say, oh, okay, now that I've seen that, it allows me to understand what we see in the application package.
Copy. I do think it's a little ironic that you're saying there's like a paper application and you're all about technologies. We need to upgrade your system. I don't make applications, but somebody's out there as part of the me can make you an application to go through that. But um,
Absolutely. It's funny that you say that, John, because we've had those conversations. And the reason that our program is so paper-based is because it is a litigation management tool. So
mm,
having evidence, when we provide protections to applicants, um, the advantage is that now they have something that they can take into court with them if for some reason there is an act of terrorism and their technology is implicated in such an event.
mm.
And so, if that happens, we need to make sure that we have the evidence to support any sort of litigation that takes place.
Copy. So that the document that I think of when I think of emergency management, like the only like legal document that we would probably use that I was aware of before this was like a continuity of operations plan, which shows like delegations of authorities who can
Absolutely.
essentially sign the check when the person who signs the check is not in the office or make those decisions, even for evacuations. I remember working at the National Cancer Institute, and there was a conversation that if we need to evacuate the building, only the emergency coordinator, who is essentially the head of maintenance, or the director for one of the director for maintenance could actually say evacuate the building. Well, if those two people are out of pocket, whether they're at a training or in the hospital for whatever reason, they didn't have a procedure in place to do that. And so in our continuity of operations plan, we had to write out those delegations and who could do that. And
Hmm.
so from that perspective, I can conceptualize the process of what you're talking about here. As an emergency manager, emergency management is really changing our scope of from you're talking about 2002, even before that, or even maybe even up to 2010. Emergency management was really only known for the public sector, right? Like FEMA, right? Federal Emergency Management Agency. But now organizations are either hiring emergency managers or they're requiring their heads of security to have emergency management competency. As somebody who was with us to talk about security, mass care, evacuations, medical transport and triage, public relations, CBRN, and I think mass care, if I haven't mentioned that one. As we talked about that in dynamic populations, and you saw that emergency management perspective, how can emergency managers who are listening to this call, or maybe security professionals, say, "Hey, I was hired by this university. We have a big stadium." Or I'm a security, I'm head of security at, this NFL stadium, whatever. How can somebody, or rather, how can you support them and they start to interact with you so that they can overcome some of these issues?
We
And
actually work with a number of emergency managers within our applicant community.
Hmm,
Um, we often are, some of the engagements that we've had with emergency managers is collaborating and sharing, best practices, as well as just sharing where the threats are taking us. What new targets are we identifying
hmm,
such that we can respond, prepare, um, and recover
hmm,
from those. And so when we are looking or evaluating let's say, a security program, an overarching security program, we often look at their emergency response plans and incident management plans.
hmm.
Now, what we notice quite often is that plans often aren't updated. It becomes
Yes.
shelfware, and so we encourage with our applicant community that 360-degree feedback loop as it relates to emergency response and emergency management, right? So
Hmm,
you have a plan in place, you've identified what your threats and your vulnerabilities are, and what the potential consequences and impacts could be. You're
yeah.
developing a plan that is focused specifically on that. And so, there's no one size fit all. Right.
Hmm,
So thinking about what emergency management would look like on the East Coast versus the West Coast and the types of catastrophic events that can happen based on those different just geographical locations, right?
hmm,
And then making sure that your plan is it aligns with what you've identified as your risks and your threats. And then the key piece, and this is the piece that we often work really closely with our applicant community, is how do you test that?
hmm,
Making sure that you are assessing that everyone's aware of the plan, everyone knows what to do when something happens,
hmm.
and what you learn from those types of exercises. So, doing those tabletops, doing a cutover in terms of your generator. How do you know it works if you've never tested it? Right? And
Yeah.
then once you have done those assessments and those tests, what did you learn from those? And now how does it feed back into your plan? Right? So it's like that 360-degree um, w- uh, scenario that we encourage our applicant community to consider.
One of the things that this is going to be brutally honest. One of the things that bothers me about you is that you keep telling me that you're not an emergency manager, but every time you talk about emergency management, you get it. In fact, I wish I could give you a high five. Maybe we'll put in a cheering sound in here later because one of my biggest holdups, a couple problems that I've identified going around the country is the same thing. Plans are
Hmm.
outdated. They're bricks on a shelf. I call them
Hmm.
bricks.
Yeah.
And it's like you write this whole plan, you don't include any of your stakeholders. You haven't identified your gaps to train, i.e.,
Yeah.
test that generator.
Yeah.
For federal facilities, it's required. I think even hospitals, it's like once a week. But like
Yeah.
in different places, it is so sporadic of what they provide, and there's these what I would call like I think I said it this morning on a text message to somebody. I loathe the existence of cookie cutter EM companies. Or like, even somebody, and I understand if you're working by yourself and you're like, dude, I just need to have something, and so you try to find a template, but like, so you go and do find and replace and try to change the name. It doesn't work like that. You
Right.
just, I mean, gosh, you just called it up. Maybe because that the engineer in you, like East Coast versus West Coast, the hazards are so different. Well, I would say even within the
Absolutely.
same city, if it empties out at 5 p.m. and there's nobody there, that's one thing. Versus a stadium that is built around a neighborhood, the considerations for both of those, even the traffic of that, is totally different. And
Yeah.
how do they operate? And so I think that's a great call out for hazard vulnerability assessments, for emergency operations plans, for let's see what you also mentioned, training and exercises,
Hmm.
all fantastic call outs. And again, you're just another tool in the toolbox for an emergency manager to get in there. And I think it's awesome that you from a legal perspective saying, hey, we see your paper. Let's go on site. Let's do a physical review. Let's see your actual stadium. Let's get some context here. And just knocking it out of the park, quote unquote, doing it right for the right reason. And like what I would say is going above and beyond to get over some of those hurdles. When you're going in and you're developing your program, i.e., program manager, director, I've met, I think now, 7 of your staff, I believe.
Yes.
Everybody is so cool. It's like I love my job. I like working at Doberman, but if I was gonna look for another job, I might want to work with you guys. But
We have some
and
openings, John.
oh, do you? Great. Hey, for those who are listening, don't apply because I'm gonna apply. So like with your team though, what I found was really fascinating was that everybody's really cool. They have that culture. They all believe, but the personal experience is so totally different.
It is.
You had a military officer for like 20
Yeah.
years who's like hyper focused on fitness. You have somebody who's written her own book on spirituality. Like you have the whole gambit. How do you work with such a diverse population? And how have you created a culture within the DHS Safety Act implementation so that people are so I don't know if loyal is the right word, but you know what I mean? Like they
Yeah.
believe in the business. They believe in what you're
Yeah.
doing. How did you create that?
It was really organic, John. What I've noticed with the team that, my deputy director and I have cultivated is we were looking for individuals that had certain skill sets, the ability to be able to build relationships and strong communication skills. And behind that team, look, I see you, John.
Yeah.
Behind that team is um, a lot of subject matter experts. When I say Green Berets and those that have
Mm,
been in the field, who have extensive years of experience, I didn't need to replace them. I didn't need
mm,
to, I wanted people within our team that, could communicate, had strong project management skills, that can build those relationships and just really was excited about the mission.
mm,
And it has been really organic for our team. They come in 6 months, 75% of our team are new. They've been with
mm.
us maybe less than a year.
Oh wow.
And they've come in and they've read a number of application packages. They've seen what uh, the discipline, the rigor, the thoroughness in terms of our evaluations. They've seen just what we're protecting, right? To
Yeah.
protect the homeland. I always like to share a really good story where one of our evaluators said to me when I came on board that he had visited a venue, and when he left that venue, he was like, "My family and I will never visit this venue, ever."
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't care who's performing. I don't care who's playing. We're not going to this venue.
Yeah.
And after about a year and a half of working with this particular venue, um, our evaluator was like, this is best in class.
That's awesome.
They've understood what they wanted, what they needed, where their gaps were, and they really leaned in to improving. And that's really the
Mm.
whole basis of the Safety Act program. It is an innovation and incentivizing program. That's what we want.
This is my second brutal truth to you on this. Maybe the brutal truth about DHS Safety Act, we'll call this, but I don't believe you when you say it's organic because I have seen your leadership approach up close and personal. I've seen your staff and how they talk about you. I've seen how they talk about the program, and no discredit to them about being professionals and wanting to get involved and understanding protecting the homeland. You've seen it, if you've seen the scenarios, right? If
Yeah,
something catastrophic with the tools that are currently available happen at a stadium, it will be worse than 9/11, period.
agree.
And to think about that, so I don't want to discredit them, but at the same time, leadership is required. And leadership keeps a team together, especially if 75% are under a year. There
Yeah.
was one gentleman that I met. Oh man, I apologize for skipping out his name. It was his first training he'd ever been to last year. He was younger. Gosh, who was it?
It probably was Joelle.
Joel. Yes, yes, Joel. And to hear his enthusiasm to working with you, to working in this program, to see I actually feel kind of bad for him because no joke. Again, brutal truth. Uh, every training scenario that he goes into will be more boring than what he had to experience with us. Top of the line, but like the reality is, it's like building a culture and maintaining a culture is very difficult, especially if there's either turnover or the program's growing and you need to add
Yeah.
several members to your team. We have, from a Doberman perspective, kept that alive based off of three metrics, and I don't know what your metrics are. I'd love to hear what those are. But I constantly, and they know this, I constantly judge my staff off of three principles:
Okay.
intelligence. They need to be highly intelligent. They need to have a high moral code, and they need to be incredibly ambitious.
Mm,
And if one of those are ever misaligned, there's a problem. For
mm,
example, if their ambition is higher than their moral code, they're going to do something wrong, and we need to get them out of here. If their intelligence is high but their ambition is low, that creates arrogance and not a lot of work. And so, keeping those three things in balance has allowed us, every time somebody comes in, we have a work culture where it's like, oh, I can be ambitious. Oh, I can provide ideas.
mhm.
They encourage me to share ideas. Not every idea is a good idea, but lots of seeds help, build a forest, right?
Yeah.
So, or plant the garden. So, in terms of this last segment here, your thoughts, where an emergency manager or really anybody can take on from leadership perspective, what are I understand, like, so when I was at FEMA, I don't know if DHS does this too, like there's yearly evaluations or even
Mhm.
quarterly evaluations. What are the tenets for you, those pillars that you would provide another new leader in the field saying, hey, here are the tenets that I would judge your staff off of?
Mm, I love that question, John. The first one that comes to mind for me, and I say this to my team quite often, is to be curious.
Ooh,
Be
Ted
willing
Lasso.
to yes, be curious. That's a huge piece for me because, particularly on this program, as I mentioned, we look at a lot of documentation, and
Mm,
it can start to it can wear on you.
mm-hmm.
Um, and things start kind of looking the same after a while. But starting, encouraging them to be curious, to ask, questions that they may think are just totally dumb, right?
Mm,
If it's something that pops up or resonates for you, don't let that go.
yeah.
And it's something that the team has really leaned into.
I really like the phrase. There's no such thing as a stupid question, only stupid people. Wait, no, that's not right. I love curious people and
Yeah, I
curious
do too.
questions. I
I do
think it
too.
helps. I think there is a difference though between being curious, and being pessimistic. As we walk out of here, if somebody has been listening in, like, I had no idea what DHS Safety Act was, I need this, I don't even know where to start. Where can somebody go to find you, essentially?
Yes. So I would recommend reach out to us, access our website at safetyact.gov. That is a direct line into our program. You have an opportunity to see all of the information about our program, the different types of resources that we have available to the private sector. And also, just we often have webinars and all sorts of training material. We also point many of our external stakeholders to best practices. So it's just a wealth of information, and we're about to roll out a brand new website refresh. So even if you touch base with us and take a look at that website today, make sure you come back in about 30 days and see its new look and feel and the fresh material.
Well, keeping it fresh with DHS Safety Act. Tasha, thank you so much for meeting with me today, for providing that guidance. Again, calling yourself that saying you're not an emergency manager is a misnomer. You obviously get it, and I think you provide a lot of really great tools just on this podcast alone for people to dive down and really start thinking about their own considerations. But hopefully we can help out a few more people out in the field and say, hey, like, I need to start looking at this counterterrorism stuff and these big T technologies as well as the soft technologies, and kind of go from there. If you liked this episode, which you should have, because Latasha Thompson is amazing, you need to give us a 5-star rating and subscribe. Go onto our social media channels for Disaster Tough Podcast. Tell us about your thoughts. Tell us about how you've changed from bricks on a shelf to taking that 360 approach. Where have you found successes? We would love to hear that from the community, and we'll see you for the next one.